Although annihilation is always a possibility, my last episode about the afterlife focused on how humans throughout history have tended to see heaven or hell as the ultimate destinations after death. But some believe another route exists, one that involves sticking around a little bit longer, a life as a ghost. Belief in spectral disturbances is far more common than most realize. In 2024, 61% of American adults admitted that they believe in ghosts. That's 4 percentage points higher than those who believe in aliens, and 9 points lower than those who believe in the devil. I'm naturally skeptical, especially when it comes to the supernatural. I've never personally witnessed anything otherworldly, either positive or negative. But my skepticism has been challenged twice. In both instances, it was the conviction of someone I trust that made me pause and think, what if? Keanu Reeves of Bill and Ted fame had a similar experience. When he was 6 or 7, he saw an apparition floating inside an empty jacket. At first, he was intrigued and willing to dismiss it as imagination, until he noticed the reaction of his nanny, who was clearly terrified. That's when he started to believe. With a healthy dose of skepticism, I thought it would be interesting to dive into the history behind those who remain, ghosts and other spectral encounters, and explore how they've inspired some of the most enduring and terrifying tales throughout history. You're listening to Empires, Anarchy, and Other Notable Moments, a podcast designed for deep dives that assist in the teaching of history. This series focuses upon supernatural occurrences related to the other side. Episode number 2, Ghost Stories. The idea that spirits can linger has ancient roots. Many civilizations from Sumeria, the Congo, all the way to the Americas practice ancestor veneration, seeking guidance from the dead. In these cultures, the presence of departed loved ones was a comfort, not a terror. But if good spirits can remain among the living, it isn't a huge leap to believe that ill-intending ghosts might also exist. That logic underpinned the witch craze of the 16th century. In 1487, Heinrich Kramer, a Dominican inquisitor from Tyrol, published a text that would shape European views of supernatural evil for 2 centuries. The Malleus Maleficarum, the Hammer of Witches. Briefly co-signed by fellow inquisitor Jacob Sprenger, likely for credibility, the book was both a theological treatise and a judicial manual, a guide for identifying, prosecuting, and eradicating witches. Its reception by the church was mixed at first, but by the 16th century it was second only to the Bible in circulation across much of Central Europe. The Malleus Maleficarum was written for an audience both deeply religious and afraid. In a society where heaven, hell, angels, and demons were literal truths, God's miraculous power was fact. Unexplained events, like sudden illnesses, failed crops, violent storms, or ghostly visions, were rarely coincidences. If God could intervene for good, so too could the devil act to destroy. Strange happenings weren't mere signs, they were threats, and they needed to be rooted out. The church has long maintained that only God could raise the dead. That meant apparitions, reverence, and ghostly figures walking among the living could not be the souls of the dearly departed. Instead, these phenomena were demonic deceptions, evil spirits impersonating the dead to sow chaos and corruption. And if demons were real, so too were those aiding them, the witches. The Malleus Maleficarum offered clear signs of witchcraft, many targeting women disproportionately. Symptoms included an inability to weep, sudden bruises or marks, often called witches' marks, an intense aversion to sacred objects, or the presence of a familiar, an animal companion believed to assist the witch. Midwives were often accused of using childbirth to offer infants to the devil. Women who were unmarried, childless, outspoken, or poor were particularly vulnerable. Their societal marginalization made them easy scapegoats, and the Malleus Maleficarum provided both legal and spiritual justification for their persecution. One infamous case is Katharina Hanoit, a postmaster from Cologne in the early 1600s. Accused by a rival of using witchcraft to sicken nuns, she was arrested, tortured, and burned, despite no evidence. In Würzburg and Bamberg, Germany, entire communities were engulfed in hysteria. Over 900 people were executed between 1626 and 1631. Across the Atlantic, in Salem, Massachusetts, we see echoes of the same logic. Spectral evidence, paranoia, and gendered fear converging into lethal prosecutions. The Malleus Maleficarum also warned that what some believed were the souls of the dead, knocking on walls, appearing in mirrors, or walking halls at night, were actually demonic entities. To believe otherwise was to fall into Satan's trap. These visitations, the authors claimed, were temptations designed to draw people away from the church's authority. The devil didn't only attack with fire and fang, he cloaked himself in familiar faces and lingering memories. Not every inquisitor followed Kramer's path. In Spain, where the Inquisition is famously associated with torture and public execution, a different approach emerged in the early 1600s. Inquisitor Alfonso de Salazar Friz investigated mass accusations of witchcraft in the Basque region. Rather than rubber stamp prosecutions, he sought evidence. Over 8 months, he interviewed nearly 1,800 people, including alleged witches, and reviewed supposed magical crimes. His conclusion was revolutionary. There was no proof. Most accusations were based on hearsay, fear, or suggestive questioning. Salazar argued that belief in witches had done more damage than witches themselves. Surprisingly, the Spanish Inquisition accepted his findings. Witch trials in Spain dropped dramatically, while Germany and France continued executions into the late 1700s. The legacy of the Malleus Maleficarum, however, endured. Ghosts, demons, witches, and revenants blurred together in the public imagination. A knock at the window, a cold gust, a half-seen shadow in the hallway. These weren't just superstition. They were, in the eyes of many, signs of something real and something evil. If the devil could masquerade as the dead, manipulate the living, and stir fear with invisible forces, then what could God do by contrast? In a world so invested in the belief the spiritual forces shape the physical, people looked not just for signs of evil, but for reassurance that divine grace could pierce the veil. That belief found powerful expression in Eucharistic miracles. Events in which the consecrated bread and wine of communion were said to physically transform into flesh and blood, or otherwise defy natural laws. For believers, these miracles are literal, concrete proof of Christ's presence in the Eucharist, a cornerstone of Catholic doctrine formalized at the Fourth Lateran Council in 1215 with the concept of transubstantiation. These stories aren't rare footnotes. The Vatican has officially recognized over 130 Eucharistic miracles, spanning the early medieval period to the present day. One of the most famous occurred in Italy around the 8th century. A Basilian monk reportedly doubted the real presence of Christ during Mass. And then, before his eyes, the bread visibly turned to flesh, the wine to blood. That flesh and blood were preserved and remain on display today. Tests in the 1970s by scientists from the World Health Organization and Italian researchers claimed the flesh was human cardiac tissue, and the blood type AB, the same type often cited in other relics, including the Shroud of Turin. Another occurred in Siena, Italy in 1730. Thieves stole a ciborium containing over 300 consecrated hosts from the Church of St. Francis. Days later, the hosts were recovered, dumped in a poor box, dirty and desecrated. Rather than destroy them, the local bishop had them reverently cleaned and placed in a tabernacle. Over 250 years later, the hosts remain perfectly preserved, unfaded, unspoiled, immune to decay, despite the lack of preservatives. Multiple scientific studies that confirm their freshness are difficult to explain. For believers, these events aren't magic tricks or ghostly apparitions. They are divine confirmation, God reaching into the world, reminding humanity He is present, especially in the most sacred of rituals. Most happen quietly, witnessed by few, yet their reputations grow over time, reinforcing faith, just as the devil's supposed interventions fuel fear. What's particularly interesting is the tension with science, yet how science is drawn in. In nearly every Vatican investigation, secular scientists are consulted to verify the phenomenon. Whether or not one believes in the miracle's divine origin, the facts are often puzzling. Like ghosts, demonic possession, or witchcraft, Eucharistic miracles rely on eyewitness testimony, subjective experience, and a culture that sees no conflict between the physical and spiritual worlds. For many, the boundary between those worlds is thinner than we like to admit. And so, if God can reach down and manifest as bread made flesh, it stands to reason for many that the devil might try the same in reverse, which brings us inevitably to the dark mirror of divine presence, demonic possession and exorcism. Like most people, I hold my family members in high regard. My sister's a lawyer, well-educated, level-headed, and not someone prone to flights of fancy. So when she told me she was shaken after attending a talk on exorcisms at her parish, I paid attention. The speaker that night was Father Vincent Lampert, one of just 50 Catholic priests in the United States officially trained as an exorcist. When he started his work over 2 decades ago, there were only 12. Today, he's one of the church's most visible and vocal exorcists, often appearing in interviews, podcasts, and public lectures in an effort to bring both transparency and spiritual urgency to his role. According to Father Lampert, the rise in reported possessions tracks closely with the decline in religious faith. As belief in God diminishes, he argues, people unknowingly open spiritual doors they don't fully understand, through practices ranging from occult rituals to Ouija boards. For Lampert, exorcism isn't superstition, it's spiritual warfare. He's spoken publicly about levitating bodies, spinning heads, and even confronting Beelzebub himself. And his message is consistent. If the devil exists and was cast out of heaven but not from the world, then ignoring him only makes his influence grow. Though many cultures have their own version of possession, exorcism as a defined ritual belongs primarily to Christianity, and even more specifically to Catholicism. In the Catholic tradition, the act of driving out demons traces directly to Jesus himself, who cast out spirits as a regular part of his ministry. These biblical stories became the foundations of the Church's formalized exorcism rites, first recorded in Latin texts by the 3rd century. By the Middle Ages, the Church had developed official prayers and manuals, and being an exorcist was considered a minor order, one of the first steps towards priesthood. But Catholic doctrine made a key distinction. Only God has the power to raise the dead or create true miracles. Any unnatural phenomena, especially if accompanied by chaos, fear, or malice, was therefore not divine, but demonic. And as with Eucharistic miracles or visions of saints, these events were scrutinized and investigated. This theological tension between belief in supernatural good and the possibility of supernatural evil remains central to the way the Church understands possession. But by the Enlightenment and into the modern scientific era, many behaviors once attributed to demons began to fall under the purview of medicine. Neurological conditions like Tourette's syndrome with its tics, involuntary movements, or outbursts, or epileptic seizures, primarily those affecting the temporal lobe, which can induce vivid hallucinations, altered consciousness, or religious experiences, came to be seen through a clinical lens. As understanding of mental illness expanded, the assumption that a person could be taken over by an outside force became less tenable to many. Father Lampert is fully aware of this shift, and he welcomes it. In his words, "I'm looking for something that's outside the scope of mental illness. That's why I use mental health professionals, a psychiatrist, for example. They can even be a non-believer. I'm not asking them, do you think this person is possessed? I'll make that determination. But I want the best possible information I can get." Lampert only proceeds with an exorcism when he reaches what the Church calls moral certitude, a level of confidence that something is happening beyond the scope of psychology or medicine. And by his estimate, that happens extremely rarely. I think it's 1 out of every 5,000 people that I deal with who are truly dealing with demonic possession. It's real, it does happen, but it's not as prevalent as people think, the father says. Many cases, he explains, are not possession at all, but other forms of demonic influence that fall under categories like infestation, evil affecting a place via strange noises, electronics malfunctioning, and foul odors. There's also vexation, physical attacks such as scratches or bruises, as well as obsession, which is mental harassment, intrusive thoughts, or irrational fixations, such as reoccurring sightings of the number 666. Lastly, there's oppression, a form of spiritual burden that weighs heavily on a person's life or emotions. The Church, Lampert emphasizes, is not looking to frighten people, but to help them recognize both the dangers of spiritual openness and the healing that comes from faith. He also discusses the devil's ordinary activity, not demonic possession or haunted houses, but temptation itself. In his view, the devil works most effectively through subtle patterns. He uses a 4-stage plan of attack: deception, that leads to division, which leads to diversion, and finally to discouragement. The father continues by saying, when we buy into lies, we feel broken. Instead of turning to God, we find substitutes, addictions, obsessions. We get discouraged. That's where the devil wants us to stay. And sometimes, he says, he still witnesses things that push even his well-formed theology to its limits. In one particularly memorable case, he was walking through a psychiatric ward carrying the Eucharist, the consecrated host the Catholics believed to be the literal body of Christ. One patient, with no way of knowing what he held, snarled and recoiled in fury, as if reacting to something unseen. It wasn't a conclusive sign, but it wasn't easily dismissed either. I found it fascinating that my sister, someone I've always seen as grounded and rational, began to question a few things after hearing Father Lampert speak. But it was another thing entirely to discover that someone else close to me has actually been in the room during an exorcism. Now, to be clear, I'm still not entirely convinced. So many situations can be chalked up to mental illness or the power of belief itself. People thinking they're possessed rather than actually being possessed. But in this case, the person who shared his experience had no agenda. He wasn't trying to convert me. He wasn't writing a book and wasn't trying to sell salvation. He simply shared what he had seen because I asked. And once again, I found myself in that uncomfortable but thought-provoking place where your skepticism gets pierced. Not by proof, but by trust. It's different when it's someone you respect, someone you know isn't prone to embellishment, looking you straight in the eye and saying, "I saw something I can't explain." Father Lampert often mentions that privacy laws prevent exorcisms from being recorded, but he does always include at least one family member in the room during the procedure, which is largely just praying with or nearby the subject. And even if they could be, he argues, no video would ever be enough. People would dismiss it as Hollywood effects or clever editing, which is why he believes, and frankly so do I, that the most powerful evidence doesn't come from special effects or viral clips. It comes from those who have no incentive to say they witnessed the supernatural, and yet they still do. One of the most striking examples of this comes from a place not often associated with demonic activity, Gary, Indiana. Once a booming steel town, it earned pop culture nods from the Music Man and was the childhood home of Michael Jackson. But Gary also experienced deep decline, even earning the grim distinction of the murder capital of the US in the 1980s. And then, in 2011, it made headlines for something even darker. The Indianapolis Star broke the story about what came to be known as the Demon House, the home of Latoya Amons, a mother who claimed her children were being terrorized by forces she couldn't explain. The shocking part? This wasn't a ghost hunting show or a viral YouTube video. These reports came from Child Protective Services, Gary police officers, and licensed psychologists, all of whom were documenting things they couldn't believe they were writing down. There were reports of a child being thrown against a wall by unseen force. Another walked backwards up the wall in front of medical staff and police, something they swore was physically impossible. A third child was said to have levitated out of her bed in the presence of multiple secular witnesses. These were trained professionals, most of them approaching the case with skepticism, even cynicism. They were looking for child abuse, not demons. But time and again, their reports reflected a growing unease, the realization that they had no explanation. Imagine being a caseworker tasked with investigating bruises on a child, only to return to your office and write in your official report, the injuries may have been caused by an invisible force. The house gained national attention. It was eventually bought by ghost hunter Zach Bagans, who produced a documentary titled Demon House. Netflix followed with a dramatized film called The Deliverance. Both open with that now familiar phrase, based on a true story. And honestly, that phrase is usually enough to make me roll my eyes. But in this case, with the names, the statements, and the evidence all coming from people who had nothing to gain, it becomes harder to dismiss. While tales of possession grip the imagination with images of torment and spiritual warfare, many encounters with the supernatural are far less aggressive, but no less unsettling. In these instances, it's not about spirits taking control, but rather simply making themselves seen. These are the stories of ghosts, not demons clawing their way into souls, but restless spirits appearing in the world of the living. Some seem tragic, bound to a place by grief or unfinished business. Others terrifying, faces appearing in darkened mirrors, footsteps echoing in empty hallways, shadowy figures vanishing through walls. Unlike exorcisms, ghost sightings typically don't involve religious rites or holy relics. There's no head spinning, no prayers in Latin, and yet they're some of the oldest and most enduring supernatural beliefs in human history. From the ancient Egyptian Ka, believed to linger with the body after death, to the Roman lemurs, malevolent spirits of the unburied dead, cultures around the globe have described encounters with the departed. Sometimes they're mournful, sometimes playful, and sometimes just they're watching. And although interpretations vary widely, from ancestral blessings to malevolent warnings, these sightings are almost always tied to a central belief: that something of us remains after we die. And unlike demonic possession, which is almost entirely associated with a religious belief, ghost sightings span religious, cultural, and even secular lines. You don't need to believe in the devil to be haunted by something unexplained in the night. In fact, some of the most famous hauntings in history were documented by soldiers, noble families, skeptics, and even kings. And across time, we see a familiar pattern: an unexplained occurrence, a rational mind attempting to understand it, and a lingering question: what if it really happened? So in this next section, we're going to look at some of the most well-known ghost stories in history, from ancient times to the modern era, and explore not only the events themselves, but why they have endured. We'll consider the historical record, the psychology, and the very human reasons that we continue to see ghosts, even when we swear we don't believe in them. When we think of ghost stories, we rarely imagine the average person. Instead, it's the historically significant, the royals, the revolutionaries, the assassinated presidents who seem most likely to return from the dead. And that's not just a coincidence. Historian Owen Davies, who specializes in the history of the supernatural, argues that famous ghosts endure not necessarily because they haunt us more, but because their lives and often their deaths were already larger than life. They come with drama, mystery, betrayal, and violence, the exact ingredients we associate with restless spirits. And there's something else at play: cultural memory. The more we remember someone in life, the more likely we are to project them into the afterlife. We're less likely to see a ghost in our attic of a farmer who died quietly in 1742, and far more likely to feel a presence when walking through Ford's Theater. We memorialize tragedy, we retell trauma, we even place plaques where something horrible happened. And whether we intend to or not, we create fertile ground for stories to return, not just as history, but as hauntings. So let's take a look at some of the most famous historical figures whose spirits, according to legend, have refused to rest quietly. Arguably, the most famous ghost in English history is Anne Boleyn, the ill-fated second wife of Henry VIII. She's said to haunt multiple locations in the United Kingdom, a legacy as fragmented as her fate. She was beheaded in 1536 on charges of adultery, incest, and treason, likely fabricated as part of a political maneuver to clear the way for a new queen. Almost immediately, stories of her ghost began to circulate. At the Tower of London, visitors have reported seeing a woman in Tudor dress walking near the site of the execution block, often carrying her head tucked under one arm. Others have claimed to see her ghostly figure in the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula, where she was buried. She's also said to appear at her childhood home at Hever Castle and at Blickling Hall, where her headless spirit is said to return each year on the anniversary of her death. The sheer number of sightings suggests less a single haunting and more a kind of cultural echo. Anne Boleyn's life was controversial, her death sensational, and her story endearing, a recipe for a ghostly legacy. The vice president who killed Alexander Hamilton in a duel is said to linger in Manhattan. Aaron Burr's post-duel life was marked by disgrace, conspiracy charges, and exile. But his spiritual presence is tied not to Weehawken, where the duel took place, but to One If by Land, Two If by Sea, a restaurant in the West Village. Once Burr's carriage house, the building now boasts a long history of supposed paranormal activity. Objects move, glasses fly off shelves, and women in particular report feeling pushed or touched. Some claim that Burr's daughter, Theodosia, who disappeared at sea in 1813, also haunts the building, perhaps reunited in death with the father she never saw again in life. As with many political ghosts, Burr's legacy was already a mix of fact, myth, and scandal. The haunting merely completes the arc. Of all the presidential ghosts, none looms larger than Abraham Lincoln. Sightings of his ghost, always solemn, never malevolent, are among the most well documented in American folklore. Lincoln is said to haunt the White House. First Lady Grace Coolidge, British Prime Minister Winston Churchill, and Queen Wilhelmina of the Netherlands all reported seeing his ghost or feeling his presence. Churchill famously emerged from the Lincoln bedroom, cigar in hand, towel around his waist, only to find Lincoln leaning by the fireplace. The Prime Minister reportedly said, "Good evening, Mr. President. You seem to have me at a disadvantage," before retreating into another room to put on his pants. Some theorize that Lincoln's spirit lingers due to the unfinished nature of his presidency, or the national trauma of his assassination. The Civil War, the Emancipation Proclamation, the theater where he was shot, all are touch points for stories of spiritual unrest. Benjamin Franklin may seem an unlikely ghost, more known for wit and scientific curiosity than spiritual lingering, but that hasn't stopped tales of his ghost haunting Philadelphia's American Philosophical Society, which he helped to found. Sightings of his statue moving or stepping off its pedestal go back to the 19th century. Some reports speak of books flying off shelves and footsteps echoing through the library late at night. Franklin's posthumous haunting feels different, less eerie than curious, almost as if his spirit continues to inspect what the living are up to. Fitting, perhaps, for a man who once said, "Either write something worth reading or do something worth writing." What connects these figures, and why are they remembered in the form of ghosts? It's not just their power or notoriety, though that helps. It's the drama of their lives and the mystery of their deaths. It's the places we remember them, palaces, taverns, halls of government. It's the human need to feel connected to history in a way that feels real. In a way, ghosts of the famous allow us to interact with history emotionally, not just intellectually. They turn the past from a paragraph in a textbook into a presence in a hallway. And whether you believe or not, there's something undeniably compelling about the idea that some lives are so impactful, they don't even end with death. It also doesn't hurt that the famous ghost helps to sell the tickets to the ghost tour being advertised in a city near you. Not all convincing ghost stories revolve around royalty or revolutionaries. In fact, some of the most intriguing accounts come not from fame, but from photographs, witnesses, and consistency over time. These stories often feel more unsettling precisely because they aren't linked to a larger-than-life figure. They're connected to people who once lived quiet, ordinary lives. The ghost of Sue Howard Hardy in Charleston, South Carolina is one example. In 1987, a professional photographer named Jack McCabe set out to capture the historic beauty of St. Philip's Churchyard in Charleston. While testing long exposure settings, he took a series of shots at a tomb belonging to Sue Howard Hardy, a woman who died in 1888, just 6 days after giving birth to a stillborn child. When the film was developed, one image stood out: a pale, semi-transparent female figure hunched over the grave. The form was clothed in period dress, her hand outstretched towards the tombstone. McCabe was stunned. He insisted no one had been in the frame and that what he captured wasn't visible to the naked eye. Photography experts and paranormal investigators have scrutinized the photo. It's never been conclusively debunked. Today, the image remains one of the most cited pieces of photographic ghost evidence in the U.S., and visitors to St. Philip's still report uneasy feelings or unexplained chills when standing near the Hardy tomb. Another example comes from Norfolk, England, in the form of the Brown Lady of Rainham Hall. One of the most famous ghost photographs ever taken is that of the Brown Lady of Rainham Hall, captured in 1936 by two photographers working for Country Life magazine. The image shows a figure descending the grand staircase, partially see-through, robed in brown and faintly glowing. Many believe this to be the ghost of Lady Dorothy Walpole, who was imprisoned in the home by her husband and died under mysterious circumstances in the 1720s. What's notable is that sightings of the Brown Lady predate the photo by over a century, and the photograph only added fuel to a haunting that had long been part of local lore. Though skeptics have attempted to debunk the image, no definitive proof of manipulation has been produced. Even if it's a trick of the light or a double exposure, the photo remains iconic, a symbol of how we often seek proof through images, even when the subject is spectral. Returning to America, we look at the Myrtles Plantation in St. Francisville, Louisiana. There, one of America's most haunted houses, the Myrtles Plantation, has long been a site of reported ghost activity. The most famous spirit is said to be Chloe, an enslaved woman who was allegedly punished and hanged after poisoning members of the family. Whether that story is fully true is debated, but what makes Myrtles stand out is the volume of reported experiences: furniture moving, footsteps, ghost children in photographs, and more. One famous 1992 photograph taken for insurance documentation, a figure appears standing between two buildings dressed in antebellum clothing, visible through slats of a screened door. The image was analyzed by the National Geographic team and considered inconclusive but unexplained. While ghost stories are often dismissed as folklore or wishful thinking, these instances remain stubborn. They don't offer certainty, but they offer just enough mystery to keep us asking questions. And sometimes all it takes is one photograph, one unexplainable moment, or one trustworthy voice saying, "I saw something," to leave us wondering if the line between life and death is as final as we once believed. I personally have never seen a ghost, but I was privy to a conversation where my grandfather was asked by a man who purchased my great-grandfather's home. Because he had already passed away, the new homeowner had never met the man who had previously lived in his new home. Once again, there was no incentive for someone to initiate this conversation. Apparently, out of the corner of his eye, he and his wife had seen what they thought of as a ghostly man. The apparitions weren't threatening, and they were regularly seen in 3 locations, all of which turned out to be my great-grandfather's favorite locations, including where his rocking chair had been and in front of his workbench. The sightings went on for years, but stopped shortly after my great-grandmother finally passed away. One of the most compelling questions is this: why do we see ghosts? Turns out there's a whole field of study dedicated to that exact question. Scientists and psychologists have been examining reports of hauntings for decades, and what they found might make you second guess even your own late-night chills. Let's start with the brain. Humans are hardwired to see patterns, especially faces, in randomness. It's called pareidolia. That face you thought you saw in the window, that shadow that looked like a man in the hallway, your brain is simply trying to make sense of visual noise. And in low light, your brain works overtime, guessing and filling in the blanks. Then there's infrasound, sound waves that are too low for the human ear to consciously detect. Some buildings, especially older ones, produce these frequencies through vibrations or wind. Studies show they can trigger anxiety, chills, and a sense of presence, even nausea. Basically, your body thinks something is wrong and your brain fills in the blank. It must be a ghost. Electromagnetic fields can also play a role. Research has shown that unusual EMF patterns, say around an old fuse box or faulty wiring, can influence parts of the brain responsible for fear and emotion. The result? You feel watched, uneasy, even frightened for reasons you can't explain. But the psychological explanations go deeper than just environmental triggers. There's also the power of suggestion. If you're told a place is haunted, you're more likely to interpret natural sounds, like a creaking floor or a door swinging shut, as supernatural. It's not fakery, it's your brain connecting dots based on the story it expects. And then there's grief. Many ghost stories don't come from thrill seekers or skeptics. They come from mourners. People who have lost loved ones and, in the stillness of a dark night, feel them nearby. Sometimes that closeness is real, at least emotionally, and whether it's a coping mechanism or something more, it provides comfort. Of course, not everyone believes. In fact, many people see ghost sightings as little more than hoaxes, and not without reason. Take the Amityville Horror. A family claimed their house was haunted after a brutal murder took place there. Their story spawned books, movies, documentaries, and decades later was largely debunked. Investigators exposed contradictions, inconsistencies, and a lack of credible evidence. Or look at crop circles. Once seen as messages from extraterrestrials, they turned out to be the work of pranksters with boards and ropes. It's no surprise that many people are skeptical. The supernatural has a hoax problem, and each time one is exposed, it makes it harder to believe the next story, even if that one happens to be true. Still, ghost belief persists. Why? Because at its core, it taps into something universal, our fear of death, our need for justice, our yearning for connection. Psychologists suggest that ghost stories often serve a social or moral purpose. They warn us, teach us, sometimes they comfort us. And in moments of stress, like during a global pandemic, belief in ghosts has actually increased. When the world feels unstable, the supernatural feels oddly like an anchor. So maybe ghosts are real, maybe they're not. But even if they aren't, our belief in them says something very real about us. So maybe what we're left with after the ghost hunts, the historical sightings, and the psychological analysis is a question not just of belief, but of response. Because even if these stories send a chill down your spine, panic isn't the answer. Take the Amons family from Gary, Indiana, the people at the center of the so-called demon house. They didn't stay frozen in fear forever. Eventually they moved on. They rebuilt their lives. The house is gone now, demolished in 2016. And while the story remains, the family is no longer haunted by it. Even Father Lampert, a man who stood in the room with bodies levitating, who stared into eyes claiming to belong to Beelzebub, even he tells people not to live in fear. When asked if we should be afraid of the devil, he actually laughs. Because in his eyes, if the best the enemy can do is hiss and scream and throw tantrums, then the forces of darkness are weaker than they want you to believe. He says the real armor isn't a wooden stake or a silver bullet. It's faith. It's community. It's knowing who you are and what you stand for. In his words, evil only truly wins when it convinces you that you're alone. But the fear of death and what might linger after it hasn't always led to ghost stories. Sometimes it's led to something darker, something that required not just spiritual defenses, but literal ones. And that brings us to one of the oldest, most unsettling categories of the undead. Not a ghost, not a demon, a revenant. Long before Hollywood gave us vampires and the Walking Dead, there were tales of bodies climbing out of graves, not as metaphors, but as real threats. In medieval Europe, especially across regions like England, Iceland, and Eastern Europe, people believed the recently deceased could rise again, not as ghosts or shadows, but as bloated, stinking corpses, revenants. The word itself means one who returns. And that's exactly what people feared. Someone who had died, clawing their way back to the world of the living and bringing chaos with them. Unlike the ghosts we associate with creaky old houses or tragic deaths, revenants weren't transparent or wistful. They were physical. Rotten bodies, still full of rage and disease, who could strangle you in your sleep or whisper in your dreams until you went mad. They weren't strangers either. In many cases, the revenant was a neighbor, a black sheep in the family, or someone who had always stirred trouble while alive, and was now suspected of continuing it from beyond the grave. And this fear wasn't just imagined, it left marks, literal ones. Archaeological digs across Europe have unearthed graves where the dead were clearly restrained. Corpses were pinned down with heavy stones, buried face down, or had large nails driven through their limbs. Some had been decapitated. Others were found with sickles placed across their throats, not as weapons but traps, designed to sever the head if the body tried to rise. These weren't random acts of cruelty, they were precautions, desperate measures taken by terrified communities who believed the dead were coming back. One of the most famous chroniclers of these events was a 12th century English monk named William of Newburgh. He didn't write ghost stories, he documented local history. And in his work, he records case after case of revenants, a man who haunted his village after death, spreading fear until his body was dug up, staked, and burned. After that, the haunting stopped. Similar tales appear in Icelandic sagas, in Slavic vampire folklore, even in Anglo-Saxon burial rituals. Across cultures and centuries, the pattern is the same. Someone dies, misfortune follows, and people begin to believe that person never truly left. Suddenly, that grave becomes a potential source of evil. In the absence of germ theory or modern medicine, a returning corpse was an easy explanation for plague, miscarriage, or a string of bad luck. And if you could identify the source, you could take control, dig them up, drive a stake through their heart, burn the remains, restore order. What's especially chilling is how official some of these acts became. While the church often dismissed revenant stories as superstition, Local clergy were sometimes the very people asked to lead the exhumations, blessing the earth while villagers carried out the final death. Sound familiar? These aren't just the roots of ghost stories, they're the foundation of vampire mythology. But the vampires of medieval Europe weren't elegant immortals in velvet cloaks. They were grotesque, swollen, dripping with blood, and sometimes chewing through their own burial shrouds. In fact, many early vampire tales are barely distinguishable from revenant stories, a sign of how deeply intertwined those fears were. Modern science now tells us the signs people once took as evidence, blood at the mouth, bloated bodies, fingernails that grew, those are all part of natural decomposition. But when you're burying your sixth relative in a month and the night air carries strange sounds, that knowledge doesn't comfort you. Fear does what it always has. It creates an enemy, and enemies must be destroyed. So before we imagined polite phantoms roaming the halls of Westminster Abbey, or headless horsemen galloping through the fog, we feared something far more primal. The bloated corpse of a villager clawing its way out of the dirt. The line between folklore and fear has always been thin, and sometimes the stories we tell don't reflect superstition, they reflect survival. In the end, whether it's a floating Eucharist, a haunted bedroom, or a corpse once chained to the earth, we're left with a lingering question. How much are we willing to believe? Throughout history, humans have sought answers in the unknown. Sometimes those answers took divine form, a miracle that reaffirmed faith. Other times they looked like a curse or a whisper in the dark. But in every case, what united the stories wasn't the certainty of what happened, it was the need to understand why. Physicist Brian Cox reminds us that if ghosts truly existed, we'd likely have found clear physical evidence by now. Science demands proof that's reproducible and measurable, and so far, those hard facts remain elusive. Yet the absence of evidence doesn't always erase the power of experience. Maybe ghosts aren't always real, but the grief that summons them is. Maybe possession isn't demonic, but the fear it triggers is ancient. Maybe, like Father Lampert said, the devil does exist. But the fact that he has to try so hard might be the most encouraging part of all. Even the revenants, terrifying and grotesque, reveal something strangely human. A desire to protect, to explain, to keep death in the ground where it belongs. We live in a world saturated with science, medicine, and reason. And yet the old stories don't die. They adapt, they linger, they show up in new forms on TikTok, in Netflix documentaries, in late-night conversations when the room gets just a little too quiet. So maybe that's the real mystery, not whether these stories are true, but why they never seem to go away. I hope you enjoyed today's episode. If you want to interact with the show, you can email us at resourcesbylowery@gmail.com or find us on Bluesky beneath the handle EmpiresPod. If you would like to financially support the show, please look in the description for more information. As always, thank you for listening, rating the show, and spreading the word.